Hello, friends. Welcome. This is Dr. Turner. I have another Christmas message to share with you. I hope you find it encouraging and inspiring. I wanted to talk about the concept of hope. And let's define that first of all. I would say hope is the anticipation of a better set of circumstances in the future than are present today. That's the idea of hope. And as we look at the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular, in the Hebrew language, there were two words that were used. One of them is yakhal, Y-A-K-H-A-L. And for example, when Noah had been inundated with a flood and was floating along in the ark, he had to yakhal for 40 days until the floodwaters receded. So here we see this idea of hoping, but a strong connotation of waiting. He had to wait in anticipation of a better set of circumstances. We also have a different word used that's slightly more visual and poetic called kavah, Q-A-V-A-H. This is really interesting. This describes tension in a cord just prior to being released, right? So it's the idea of this tense expectation. It's the idea of we know that there's going to be a release, but right now there's this tension in the cord, and we're in a state of tension. We don't see that better, different set of circumstances yet, but we're under tension at the moment. This is, for example, used quite often in the book of Psalms, where you have David or others describing being in serious dilemmas and predicaments and having to kavah until the Lord would release them, essentially. Well, let's talk about, our present spiritual lives and just our lives here on earth as we go through our days, right? Do we have a basis for hope? Do we have any honest reason, any intellectually sound, spiritually grounded reason to think that circumstances are going to be better in the future than they are today? I don't want false hope. I want honest hope. And I think for me, it comes down to the character of God. That's the answer. If you look at the Old Testament, for example, if you're familiar with it, the Jewish nation was in slavery in Egypt for several hundred years. That whole time, though, God had not forgotten about them, and they were in a state of hoping. They were waiting. There were intense expectation for their release. You can also think about the situation of African Americans here in our country. As some of you know, I'm part African American, very proud of that history, and it's a fascinating story in many respects. I looked it up recently, and it turns out the first African slaves were brought to Hampton, Virginia in 1619. And yet the Emancipation Proclamation was not signed by Abraham Lincoln until 1863. So that's 244 years of slavery in the United States. And then if you consider further that black people really didn't get full participation in government until approximately 100 years later during the Civil Rights Movement, culminating in the Civil Rights Act being signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964, you have basically 244 plus 100 more years until full political representation was given. And what gave our community strength during that time? What gave Martin Luther King strength during that time, for example? He's very famous for a quote that he had. He said, "We shall overcome because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Why would he say that? Why would the moral arc of the universe bend at all? And why would it bend towards justice? And what gave him such confidence to say, we shall overcome because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice? If not for the fact that he believed in a God who controls the universe, who set moral laws in place, and who is in fact a God of justice. I also get very inspired by the story of Nelson Mandela. Again, I like history. And I remember when I grew up in the 80s, the big concept on the socio-political world stage was the apartheid regime in South Africa. It was a big deal. There were boycotts going on. It was considered this very aggressive, militaristic, racist state, with a small minority of people enslaving millions. And it was seen as grossly unjust and needing urgently to be toppled and to be changed. And there was a lot of unrest and turmoil, especially directed towards freeing Nelson Mandela, who was sort of seen as political prisoner number one, cause célèbre on a worldwide stage, as you may recall. Well, when you research his life, it's very interesting. Nelson Mandela grew up as a strong Christian. He had a relationship with God throughout his whole life. And this led him to a strong interest in social justice. Well, after getting his law degree, this led him into cross purposes with the South African government, and he was considered a communist and an agitator, and ultimately was sent to prison at age 46 for being an enemy of the state, essentially. And for the first 18 years of his imprisonment, he was at a place called Robben Island, which, if you look it up, was quite a bleak situation. He had a small concrete cell with a straw mat, and every day they would take the prisoners of Robben Island outside to literally break rocks into gravel. That was their hard labor every single day, day after day. These men, given minimal amounts of food and rest, were handed sledgehammers and told to break rocks into gravel. And when that was done, they switched over to a lime quarry, and they had them mining lime by hand in this quarry. The sun was so bright as it came off the lime, and they initially prohibited him from using sunglasses, that his eyesight was permanently damaged throughout his whole life. Well, fast forward, he remains in prison until 1990 at age, 72. So that was 26 years later. He's finally released from prison. And 4 years after that, he becomes president of the first reconstituted democratic government of South Africa. Now, is that extraordinary or what? I mean, if you can't see God writing an amazing story that's biblically worthy, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, right? But I often wonder how he felt during those first 18 years of imprisonment, being imprisoned unjustly on some godforsaken island, doing hard labor with a sledgehammer, breaking rocks into gravel for 1 day, for 1 month, for 1 year, for 2 years, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 18 years, and then being transitioned to other prisons, again, to serve out a full sentence of 26 years total, life stolen from him. He must have thought, where is God in all this? And what did I do to deserve this? And yet God wasn't done with him, and God had a plan he could not have imagined, I'm sure, as he was slaving away with a sledgehammer in the hot sun, that he was going to be the president, the ruler, and the most beloved figure of a new South African government. I trust that Nelson Mandela had hope in God through that time. I hope he had a sense of, I'm just waiting right now. I'm under tension. Things are not as they should be, but I know the character of God, and I know that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and I'm going to see it bend towards justice in my lifetime. And that's exactly what he saw. So if we transition towards our own lives and we think about our own hope and our own connection with God, I want to leave you with some encouragement out of the Bible. There's a book called Romans, and in chapter 15, verses 13, which I'll share with you, there's a really striking statement. And it says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." Okay? Now there's a lot in that verse, but I want to just say this. Did you catch that? He's called the God of hope. That's part of his name. That's one of the names of God in the Bible, right here. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace. So here we see the very character of God as hopeful. It's part of his name, and it's part of what offers us, therefore, a comfort in knowing him as we look to the future. We too can anticipate a better state of affairs. We may have to wait years, decades, or even generations, as the case may be. But if we reflect on the character of God, we can be hopeful. I hope this message encouraged you. I've had to rely on these concepts greatly in my own life at different points, and now as well as I'm going through some things with Washington State. You may know they're trying to shut us down, and my attorneys are very capably representing me, and I'm so thankful for that. We're doing some fundraising at the present time, asking for your kind donations so that we can pay expert witnesses to look over our case and defend us. The hearing is currently scheduled for March. These are people like Dr. Corey and others who need to be compensated for their time and their goodwill in offering to look over everything related to my case and to defend me to the best of their ability. I'm very grateful for them, and I'm grateful for any support you can give us at this time. Thank you, and I hope that you would be filled with hope based on the character of God this Christmas season. Take care.